On June 1, 2009, Air France Flight 447 was cruising at 35,000 feet over the Atlantic Ocean. It was the middle of the night. The cabin lights were dimmed. Most passengers were asleep, unaware that anything was wrong. This was a routine overnight flight from Rio de Janeiro to Paris, a route flown every day, a flight the crew had completed many times before. The aircraft was an Airbus A330, a modern wide-body jet equipped with advanced computers, automation systems, and multiple layers of redundancy. By every measurable standard, it was one of the safest planes in the sky. But that night, safety slowly unraveled. Ahead of the aircraft was a massive storm system stretching for hundreds of miles. Thunderstorms like this were common over the Atlantic, especially along the equator. The pilots adjusted their course slightly to avoid the most intense weather, a normal decision that raised no alarms. Inside the cockpit, everything still looked stable. The plane was flying smoothly. The autopilot was engaged. There was no sense of urgency. Then, high above the ocean, something small began to fail. On the nose of the aircraft were 3 Pitot tubes. These sensors measured how fast the plane was moving through the air. They were simple devices, but they fed critical information to the aircraft's computers. As the plane flew through the storm, tiny ice crystals began to build up inside those sensors. The Pitot tubes partially froze. Almost instantly, the aircraft's computers began receiving conflicting airspeed data. The plane could no longer reliably determine how fast it was flying. As designed, the autopilot disconnected. The sudden change caught the pilots off guard. The cockpit alarms sounded. Warning lights appeared. The aircraft shifted from a highly automated system to full manual control. At cruising altitude, this was one of the most demanding situations a pilot could face. The air was thin. The margin between flying too slow and flying too fast was extremely small. And the instruments were no longer giving clear answers. As the pilots tried to understand what was happening, the aircraft began to climb. Pulling back on the controls felt like the correct response. But at that altitude, climbing caused the plane to lose speed rapidly. The airspeed readings continued to fluctuate. Some instruments showed the plane was accelerating. Others showed it slowing down. The pilots trusted the wrong information. As the speed dropped, the aircraft reached a critical point. The wings could no longer generate enough lift to keep the plane flying. The aircraft entered an aerodynamic stall. A stall warning sounded in the cockpit, but the warning was intermittent. It stopped and restarted as the sensors continued to give unreliable data. Instead of pushing the nose down to regain speed, the pilots believed the plane was overspeeding. They pulled back harder. The aircraft climbed briefly, then began falling. For more than 3 minutes, Air France Flight 447 descended through the night sky, stalled, nose raised, engines still running at full power. The plane was not breaking apart. It was not out of control in the way people imagine. It was simply no longer flying. Inside the cockpit, confusion turned into panic. The pilots discussed airspeed values that didn't make sense. They tried to diagnose a situation they had never trained for in this exact way. At one point, one pilot asked why the plane was descending. Another replied that he didn't understand either. They never realized the aircraft was stalled. At 2:14 in the morning, after falling more than 38,000 feet, the aircraft struck the surface of the Atlantic Ocean. The impact was violent. There were no survivors. In the days that followed, search teams scoured the ocean. Floating debris was found, bodies were recovered. But the main wreckage, along with the flight recorders, remained lost in deep water for nearly 2 years. Without the black boxes, investigators were left with questions. How could a modern jet simply fall out of the sky? Why hadn't the pilots recovered? When the recorders were finally retrieved and analyzed, the answers were devastatingly clear. This crash was not caused by a catastrophic mechanical failure. The plane was flyable almost until the moment of impact. Instead, it was a chain reaction. Frozen sensors, confusing automation behavior, insufficient manual flight training at high altitude, and human beings overwhelmed by conflicting information. After Air France Flight 447, aviation authorities around the world made changes. Pilot training shifted to place greater emphasis on manual flying skills. Stall recovery procedures were rewritten. Design assumptions about automation were reevaluated. Because this disaster exposed a hard truth. No matter how advanced an aircraft becomes, safety ultimately depends on humans understanding what the plane is telling them, especially when technology begins to fail.